Joining us is MS Now's Alex Tabbitt, Allison Kite, politics reporter for the Star Tribune in Minnesota, and Oliver Darcy, founder of Status, a newsletter covering media. Alex, what is the administration's explanation for halting child care funds across the country, and is it legal?
Well, Laura, the Department of Health and Human Services is pinning the blame for this child care funding freeze on the states themselves, writing in a statement, quote, "The onus is on the state to provide additional verification, and until they do so, HHS will not allow the state to draw down their matching funds." But, Laura, how legal this is from HHS is in question. We've been reaching out to legal experts who tell MS Now that the Trump administration has no authority to abruptly cut off funds to the state. Instead, they say the proper process includes notifying the state of noncompliance, which leads to an administrative hearing. And ultimately, if fraud is uncovered, the state would need to refund the federal government for any amount that was misspent. And Laura, if you're picking up on a recurring theme here from the Trump administration, that's because there is one. This second iteration of the Trump presidency is making a habit of big, brash policy moves or announcements and then dealing with the legal fallout or the legality after the fact. Now, Laura, there was another bombshell announcement overnight from the Small Business Administration that we should mention. The head of the SBA, Kelly Loeffler, wrote on X on Thursday that her agency is suspending 6,900 Minnesota borrowers amid suspected fraudulent activity. Loeffler also said those borrowers were enrolled in the Payment Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, which the state has been relying on heavily since the COVID-19 pandemic. In total, Loeffler says those now suspended borrowers were approved for 7,900 loans, totaling about $400 million. She also said that those borrowers would be banned from future SBA loans, including disaster loans. And Laura, one more thing. It's important to note that Loeffler didn't substantiate or provide evidence for these specific claims, at least not yet. And this all comes within the larger context of widespread fraud in the state. Years-long investigation from the Department of Justice has already convicted fraudsters to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And a few weeks ago, First Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson, a top federal prosecutor, said he believes fraud in Minnesota state-run Medicaid programs could be totaling $9 billion or more since 2018. So really fraud on a massive scale. Laura?
And thanks, Alex. And some of those convictions happening under the Biden administration. Allison, the White House and others have been quick to blame the media here. But give us a reality check. How long has the Star Tribune, your paper, been covering fraud in Minnesota?
Certainly, and thanks for having me. We've been writing about fraud in Minnesota for over a decade, since the first iteration of the child care fraud scandal in the 2010s. We've written hundreds of articles about this. We've got dozens of pending Data Practices Act requests. We are digging into this, and we are doing our best to provide the independent, fact-based reporting that we think Minnesotans deserve and value about this issue.
Oliver, what's happening in Minnesota is just one example. There are countless other examples of the president and his allies spreading false information. For example, during the 2024 campaign, there was the Haitian migrant story where Trump and J.D. Vance, now the vice president, lied about Haitians eating cats and dogs in Ohio. How does the press, which, as we all know, we're all reporters here, try to hold everyone accountable, deal with these attacks? And how do we cover stories like this where one piece of information can spiral into a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, I think it can be tricky. I think one pattern that we're seeing here is also the Trump administration spreading stories that are anti-immigrant in nature. And so that story has a lot of anti-immigrant undertones. The one we're talking about now against Somalis in Minnesota, which has also been a theme with the Trump administration, this kind of speaks to the reality we live in right now, the media environment, where anyone can just record a video, post it on social media, and if it aligns with someone's politics, it can go viral. I think what you don't expect is responsible people in government, or you would hope there would be responsible people in government, to use these videos and jump on them to set policy across the country that impacts people's lives. Unfortunately, that's something we've seen throughout this administration, starting in the beginning with USAID and how that was just gutted because of false information. misinformation. And that's what you're seeing here right now. Ironically, too, we should point out that it comes from an administration that's quick to jump on others for not being entirely accurate. If there's a tiny mistake a news organization makes, this administration exploits it to say the entire story is not accurate. In this case, we know there are inaccuracies in this video, and it wasn't fact-checked like it would be at a major news organization, and yet J.D. Vance and others are holding this up and saying that the legacy media should take notes, which is, of course, pretty ridiculous.
Right. In the legacy media and in bigger institutions, we do have ethics and standards and that we have to adhere to, and we get double-checked and triple-checked. Allison, what are you and your colleagues at the Star Tribune doing to weather the onslaught of attention, and how are you breaking through the misinformation?
I think we're, trying to do what journalists around the globe do and continue to dig for the truth, dig for information. Two of my colleagues visited the daycares highlighted in this video and requested information from the state. None of the owners of these facilities have been charged with any kind of felony. There was a case where the state had shut off payments because of an allegation of fraud against one of the facilities. That facility sued, and the state is seeking to have that case dismissed. But like I said, we're just, trying to do our jobs and continue to look for accurate information on this crisis rather than spread information that's not verified.
Oliver, as we were having this preparing for this conversation with all of you reporters here, I was struck by prior quotes made by some of Trump's closest confidants about the mission being to discredit and disorient the press. In a recent interview with the New York Times, Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene said, quote, "Our side has been trained by Donald Trump to never apologize and to never admit when you're wrong." And even going further back to 2018, Steve Bannon famously said, "The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with expletive." Are they succeeding in weakening the press, our credibility? And why should the public care if they do diminish the press?
Unfortunately, I think that they are. I think they have succeeded. I think Donald Trump over the last 10 years has done a lot of damage to the reputation of the press amongst Republicans in particular. If you look at recent polling, Republicans just do not trust the mainstream press. Instead, they are relying on outlets like Fox News, Breitbart, right-wing outlets that don't actually care about reporting the facts, reporting the truth. They're actually just feeding political information to their audiences that aligns with their ideologies. But that's where they're getting their information now, and that's largely because Donald Trump has delegitimized the press in a lot of the eyes of Republicans. And I think this is causing a lot of damage because, we can no longer agree on a shared set of facts as a country. That's, of course, what Donald Trump wants, because in the void of that, as everyone's wondering what's true and what's not, he can kind of get away with pushing forward radical policies and doing things like, really reforming the government in a way that's quite disturbing, whether it's warping the Department of Justice and the FBI or pushing anti-immigrant policies through. He can get away with a lot of that because half the country simply is supportive of it, or they don't see the information they need to see because Donald Trump has taught them not to believe it.
Thanks to all of you for your fact-based and reality-based reporting. Alex Tabbitt, Allison Kite, Oliver Darcy, thank you.